excited to introduce Reverend Bobby Patterson to you. Some of you saw her very briefly on Monday on the first day. Bobby is Professor Emerita at Emory University. She is an Episcopal priest, a well-known expert on building adaptive resilience. She literally wrote the book, Building Resilience Through Contemplative Practice. It's a field manual for helping professionals and volunteers. She has worked extensively in the intersection of contemplative practice and community engagement. She's an interdisciplinarian of religious studies. She has her body of research and publications very much focused on women's embodied spirituality to Christian and Buddhist contemplative traditions. She's worked on place-based knowledge, pedagogies for earth care, and community-based engagement. It is my pleasure to welcome Bobby. Hi, Bobby. Bobby is a longtime collaborator with me on resilience building. I'm so excited for this panel because
me too. Me too.
I see Diana, and Diana, do you remember when we met at Mind and Life in 2011 with His Holiness the Dalai Lama? So this is just wonderful to see both of you here, and I believe Dominique is joining by audio, and there is Michelle. Wonderful. Yay, Michelle. Wonderful. All right, I'm handing it over.
Can't wait. Thank you so much, Nicola. And welcome everybody to this next session, which we're diving into. Its title is Resilience as a Whole, its vision and its promise. And I did want to open with just something real that began to happen to me this morning. I was up pretty early. This conference has just been so rich and giving me so much, but I'm also in the middle of a very rich experience with our 5-month-old Russian wolfhound who has come to join our house, and he's getting me up very, very early. And it was at that moment of still darkness. He's at least beginning to be a little calm. He's been fed. I started looking at the phone, and there was messages from Dekala, and I thought about how we've known each other and cared for each other in this work for the earth and work for contemplative practice. And then I began to know the story of her being with Diana, Dr. Liverman, at a presentation of material with the Dalai Lama, and the idea of the ideas, the actions, the engagements of Dr. Michelle Johnson Jennings, citizen of the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma, just the webs that she has created. And then Dominique and I go back. I'm so thrilled to say she did some training for us on the Steering Council of the Mind and Life Institute on diversity, equity, inclusion. Ruth King was working with us on mindfulness of race, and Dominique really brought it to our bodies, brought it to our daily awareness. Anyway, in the midst of already 50-pound, 5-month-old wolfhound, I began to feel what this conference has been offering, at least for me, a sense of the webs of insight, the webs of real action on the ground, the webs that are broken, the webs that need repair, the webs that we can begin to envision, which is part of today's topic for us, to begin to see broader and bigger futures together of healing and wholeness, the promises ahead. And in that morning space where when I was first awakened, I thought, how can I hold it together? I was just profoundly aware of the kind of gratitude I carry every day for this earth that is a web of life, and for the brokenness which is teaching me, and the gaps and the community that we're building online. Many of you bring communities, so I just want to begin this session with a deep sense of gratefulness for you attending and for these wonderful, wonderful panelists. We're going to be diving in today to a broader kind of visionary angle about justice for Earth and planetary care, though every one of our speakers is going to connect this to local community spaces and places, creatures and lands, and our willingness, as Rinpoche said today, to kind of go into, at the broad level and at the smaller levels, the actual nitty-gritty of daily life. It's kind of multiple level, multiple dynamics that become actually the motors and the kind of soul and energy for change. So I'm really grateful to be welcoming them as we talk about resilience, this kind of future-looking group of thinkers together and practitioners together. I'm really honored to be with Dr. Liverman, Dr. Jensen Johnson, and Dr. Malabrides this morning. So let's dive in. Diana, you said I may call you Diana, so let's begin. Let me just introduce you, and I'll introduce each of you as we come to your presentations. We'll start with Dr. Liverman, and then Dr. Michelle Jennings, and then Dr. Malabrides. Dr. Diana Liverman is a geographer based at the University of Arizona. Her research and career is focused on the human dimensions of global environmental change, especially climate vulnerability and justice. She's had long-term involvement with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the United Nations body for assessing science related to climate. She's going to discuss with us today her recent work with the Earth Commission and to consider justice in settings that science-based kind of focus targets for protecting people and the planet. But she's also going to talk about her local role in guiding Resilience Together, which is a City of Tucson climate action plan. So Diana, welcome. Please begin.
Thank you, Bobby. And just as you're introducing me, my dog starts barking. It's about the time in the morning when the local coyotes walk in front of the house. And so if you hear quiet barking, it's the more than human other that I share my home with. Thank you for the invitation, all of you at LOCA, to participate. I'm speaking to you from Southern Arizona, the unceded lands of the Tohono O'odham. And I'm going to speak today mostly as an Earth system researcher. Often when I'm in a community of Earth scientists, I feel as though I'm representing the social sciences and humanities. But this gathering is so full of wonderful people from psychology, from activism, that I'm sort of flipping to the other side of my identity, which is the work I've tried to do with Earth scientists. And I'm going to talk a bit about something really wonderful that's happened in the last few years. And that's the ways in which concepts of resilience and of climate justice have actually entered into international scientific assessments, and the way in which many of my Earth science colleagues are now embracing justice rather than, and embracing some of the emotions around the climate crisis that probably people used to hide in their efforts to be objective, but I feel as though things have changed. And I also sort of want to ask this community, what else is there for science to do to support your work, both your work as sort of individuals exploring your own feelings, but also the activist community, because we're sitting out here doing all this research, but the research we do is not always as helpful as it might have been. And just one reflection is, over the last few years, I've become very aware that by participating in a number of these scientific assessments that are painting very serious concerns about the climate crisis, that in some ways we've contributed to people's climate grief, to apocalyptic thinking, and perhaps to not giving enough hope to people. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about how we could do that better. I'm going to try and cover 3 topics pretty briefly. The first is to talk a little bit about the IPCC and its last assessment and how it engaged with justice and resilience. Then most of what I'll talk about is the efforts that the Earth Commission, some of the Earth Commissioners made to include concepts of justice as we think about targets for protecting the planet. And then finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about bringing it back home for me, which is my response and my role in the Tucson Resilient Together Climate Action Plan. So I'm going to share my screen. Is that now visible to everybody? I hope so. Let me go into.
Yeah, I can see it, but it's giving me the whole PowerPoint.
There we go.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So this is a photo of near where I live in southern Arizona. We've had unprecedented high temperatures this summer. The storms have been so intense. There was a hailstorm with olive-sized hail the other day, which destroyed much of the vegetation in my neighborhood that we need to shade people. And all of this is consistent with some of the messages we've seen from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And for that, I think many of you are familiar with IPCC. It's a group of international scientists, mostly, almost everybody is a volunteer. They don't get paid for the work. And the IPCC has just concluded its 6th assessment cycle. The first cycle was in 1990. This one involved producing multiple reports between 2017 and 2023, focused on the latest science and observations about what's happening, the impacts, and the responses to climate change. And considering justice in terms of inclusiveness, the 6th assessment cycle was much more inclusive than many of the prior IPCC efforts. There was much better representation of women. That's something I've been very concerned about, of the social sciences, and also more people from the majority world, from the global south. There's still, of course, a lot to do in terms of inclusiveness in the preparation of IPCC reports, especially to include more Indigenous voices and knowledge, the arts and humanities, and a more radical analysis of justice. And I've got links that are on the slides, and I'll put them into the chat at the end of my talk. So the final report of the 6th assessment was the synthesis report. And sometimes there's so many media coverage of all the different IPCC reports that the ones that are actually most important come last and are often not paid as much attention to. But there were very strong messages from the report that came out a few months ago. I just put a couple of them here. The most important is that it's absolutely, and you all know this in your souls, that climate change is a threat to human well-being. And the message was that we've got a rapidly closing window of opportunity to secure a livable and sustainable future for all. But one of the things for me that was most exciting about this last round of IPCC was the way in which equity, climate justice, social justice, inclusion have become part of the IPCC reports, which are scientific assessments. And these reports have to be based on peer-reviewed scientific literature, but you all and many of my colleagues have been writing about equity and climate justice. They've been telling the stories in the scientific journals. they've been doing the data analysis to overlay climate impacts with poverty and race. And this means that IPCC can cite that literature, and that governments who try to say, oh no, we don't want that normative stuff in there, actually can't make that case anymore, because we have a scientific, social scientific, peer-reviewed basis for arguing that things are not going to change unless we address climate justice. And so these two statements are from the synthesis report, and are really important going forward. The concept that was important in this last IPCC report in terms of resilience is the idea of climate resilient development. And this is what I always call the triple win. It's identifying activities locally and globally that do everything at the same time, that they reduce emissions, they adapt to climate change, and they support the eradication of poverty and access for everybody to well-being. And the reports and the scientific literature is starting to identify many of these climate resilient development opportunities, things like, as I've mentioned here, community forests. They sequester carbon. They create cooler climates for communities, and they provide employment and local foods. Mangrove restoration in low-income communities does the same thing. It stores blue carbon. It protects people against storms and hurricanes. It enhances fisheries and supports livelihood. So this idea of climate resilient development was the final chapter in the Working Group 2 report. And it's an area where we need more as we move into the 7th assessment cycle, the next round of IPCC. We need more research, we need more evidence that will help convince primarily policymakers and national governments, but can also be a way of sharing stories across the world and across different stakeholders about these success stories. And some of the people who've spoken have offered really powerful success stories of action on the environment that has come from the grassroots and has helped people escape poverty. One of the things that's important is the voice of individual scientists in arguing for justice. And I can't shout out to all of them, but I think about Chuck Sokorecki, Lisa Schipper, Siri Erickson, Diana Ojvorsats, and Aditi Mukherjee, who are very strong, and Debbie Lay, very strong voices for climate justice and resilience in the IPCC reports. And one of the exciting things in the last couple of weeks is that a number of them are moving into leadership roles in the next round of scientific effort and the next the 7th assessment of IPCC. So let me now move to some of the work of the Earth Commission. And justice has been very important to the work of the Earth Commission. And this is a group of international scientists, a wonderful group of people that I was really very privileged to work with, brought together by a scientific organization called Future Earth, and also the Global Commons Alliance. And one of the challenges of being in the Global Commons Alliance is that we're being asked to work with a very wide range of stakeholders, including business stakeholders who, whilst of course many aspects of the private sector are responsible for emissions, there are also those that want to take responsibility and set targets for the business community in terms of protecting climate, protecting biodiversity. But one of the tensions for us has been, we're making a very big ask of them. We're not just asking them to reduce emissions 20%, we're asking them for net neutral, for restoration, for reparation. And that is quite challenging. The goal of the Earth Commission is to provide an updated assessment of planetary boundaries to avoid tipping points and systemic degradation. But what's new about what we've tried to do is to look at the justice dimensions of setting these boundaries and linking them to some targets. So just to give you a little bit of more information about what we've been doing, it builds on the planetary boundaries paper that came out in 2009. And that was the paper that I had the enormous honor to share with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which was when I met Tequila. And what's important about planetary boundaries is we're not just looking at the one crisis of climate change, we're looking at multiple crises associated with pollution and water stress and deforestation and ocean acidification. And at the time we wrote the planetary boundaries paper, there were 5 boundaries that had been transgressed. One, there was good news, the ozone depletion has improved. It's the one sort of Earth system change that was going in the right direction. So these boundaries were identified based on biophysical processes, and they didn't address how crossing these boundaries would interact with social justice and governance. Now, the wonderful Kate Raworth, in her work on donut economics, tried to show how we needed to stay within planetary boundaries while also looking at maintaining the social foundations and social justice. So the work that the Earth Commission has done is inspired by Kate and by others. And what we've tried to do is identify a set of safe and just Earth system boundaries. The safe boundaries are based on Earth system trends and avoiding tipping points, which are destabilizing the Earth system. But what we've done is say a safe boundary is not enough. It's also got to be a just boundary. It's got to be based on principles of justice, that it protects intergenerational concerns, that it is just in terms of relationships between countries and between people and with other species, that it is intersectionally just, and that it addresses the sort of principle of justice around the unequal distribution of harm from Earth system change, the unequal responsibility for Earth system change, and the importance of equity in responses to Earth system change. We also try to look at procedural justice, which is inclusion in identifying the boundaries, respect for Indigenous knowledge, and sort of epistemic justice. And as I'll show you, in terms of operationalizing Earth system justice, we're focusing on a few sort of measurable aspects of justice. One is when we set a target or a boundary, how do we minimize harm or repair harm to current and future people and other species? But at the same time, ensuring access for the millions of people who don't currently have what they need for a dignified life. They don't have water and clean energy. How do we make sure they have access at the same time as we're trying to reduce pressure on the environment? So just briefly, and I'll give you the links to the papers that this is based on. There's an updated assessment of tipping elements that we hear about now on an almost daily basis, about the fear scientists have, or the evidence connected to the fear that they have, that we're starting to see collapse in the Antarctic and in the Amazon. And what we tried to do is to look at what is the maximum temperature that we might envisage that would prevent those tipping points. And you can see here that we have tipping points occurring already at the current international target, which is 1.5. And this is from an article that came out a few weeks ago. And the safe boundary is this red circle in the middle, and the little earths are where we are now. And you can see that our updated assessment shows us far beyond over the safe biodiversity boundaries for integrity of ecosystems and protection of ecosystem area. We're also outside the safe boundary for phosphorus and nitrogen pollution. and for groundwater use. And we have specific numbers in the paper about where we are in relation to what we think the safe boundary is for avoiding tipping points. And then this is a map which looks at where multiple boundaries are being transgressed. And these are just the biophysical boundaries. Justice boundaries has a different map. And you can see so much of the Earth where more than 4 of the biophysical boundaries have been transgressed. But then what are we thinking about in terms of Earth system justice? Here we're informed by the Sustainable Development Goals. And as I said, we're trying to look at what the boundaries should be to reduce harm to individual humans and other species, as well as how do we set a boundary and also meet development goals, and how do we set a boundary that doesn't create new injustices. And these are the 2 papers. I'll put the link in the chat for those of you who are in any way inclined to read academic papers. We tried to make them accessible. But the key point here is when we started looking at minimizing harm, we realized that those biophysical boundaries that prevent collapse of the Earth system actually may be unjust, because even at those boundaries, millions of people are suffering and species are being harmed. So just as one example, we argue that because millions are already suffering at 1.5 degrees C of warming, 2.7 as Tequila was pointing out, and we have to remember that that global average is means much higher warming in specific regions, like in the Arctic or on a long way away from the oceans. And because millions are suffering, we're actually proposing that the target should be much stricter. And we can't prevent all harm, but we propose that the target should in fact be 1 degree C internationally and locally, and that we need much stricter targets in terms of reducing pollution in order to prevent harm. The second question that we ask is, what would happen if we prioritize social justice before we actually look at what's happening to the Earth system? And as I said, millions are lacking access to the resources they need to survive and thrive. And we looked at what would happen if we gave everybody basic access to energy, water, food, housing, and mobility. What would that mean in terms of pressure on the Earth system if we didn't change anything else? So if we just brought the millions of people up to a basic level without, for example, reallocating the consumption of the rich to allow those people space for access, we did a scientific calculation of what that would mean. And so what is the Earth system impact of providing this access? What does it mean for greenhouse gas emissions, water use, if we prioritize the needs of the poor? And this slide just shows the increased pressure on the Earth system that you get if you provide just access in the absence of systemic transformation. In a way, this makes the case that we need systemic transformations, individual changes in individual values, changes in political systems, changes in technology, changes in society, because without those systemic transformations, bringing the poor, giving the poor and disadvantaged access to well-being could well increase pressures on the Earth system. So the Earth Commission is now looking at the systemic transformations that are needed and trying to identify the signs that those transformations are starting to occur, and looking at what we call social tipping points that would that accelerate the transformations that we need. And then we're working with stakeholders to try to consider changes in Earth system targets. Some of the governance groups are sort of frustrated, for example, that we're saying the 1.5 target for climate is too high. It needs to be lower, because they fought for years to get the 1.5 target on the table. But we're also working with NGOs, civil society, and business groups to talk to them about how these just and safe targets might be implemented. And one of the groups we're talking about with cities, and that's going to bring me to my last little intervention, is this is both a personal, very personal thing, because working with the Earth Commission, the IPCC, feels emotionally overwhelming. It does bring burnout to many scientists. And so for me, I ask the question, well, if I can't save the people on the planet at the planetary scale, what can I do in my own community? So I've spent a lot of the last couple of years working much more locally in Arizona, and that has resulted in being part of the creation of a climate action plan for Tucson. But I wanted to say that the first thing we had to do in Arizona was change our political system. And you may look at Arizona and think, oh my gosh, that's a terribly conservative right-wing state. We're not. We elected in the last couple of elections the most amazing women as mayor, and they're women of color. My mayor, Regina Marrero, is a Latina. Climate change is one of her big issues, but we also have Kate Gallego in Phoenix, Coral Evans in Flagstaff, and Democratic progressive women have won in Arizona, and I hope that they will keep winning. So getting Regina elected meant all of us who were climate activists being out on the street, getting voters registered. The moment she was elected, she declared a climate emergency for Tucson and commissioned the Climate Action Plan. And I would argue, I'm very proud, I think our Climate Action Plan has more justice, more consideration of intersectionality, more consideration of the issues that are facing BIPOC people and people of color than any other action plan around the country. And the plan came out, it was very consultative. There were extensive consultations with communities. Of course, some people felt that their voices weren't heard, but then the mayor and council adopted the plan, and they've already invested $80 million in climate resiliency, whether that's cooling centers, tree planting, trying to subsidize solar, and dealing with the challenges faced by people living in manufactured housing, for example. So I wanted to end with that as the way in which we can take action locally, but it involves political action, and then it involves working. Many of the climate action plans around the country do not look at environmental justice. And there was the youth climate movement, the neighborhood associations all pushed our city to make sure that we have a plan that's about resiliency for everyone and reparations for those who have long suffered from the impacts of colonialism and racism. I'll just leave this here to finish. This is the statement that is about just and equitable climate action in the plan, but I'll put a link to the plan.
Oh, please do.
So
please.
I'll stop sharing and thank you. I know I talk and talk and talk, but I'm really excited about particularly this local action and to share what the scientists have been doing.
Wow, the expansiveness, Diana, from seeing the global work and how even in the global context, there's kind of new leadership coming in and new future work, but really adding the dimension of the local experience and the kind of nitty-gritty and the politics, which is critical, and the kind of inclusion of multiple communities and voices. Tremendous work. Thank you so much. I was thinking we might have a question little by little, but I'm going to turn to Dr. Johnson-Jennings now and make sure that we get these presentations in, and let's not feel, Dr. Johnson-Jennings, any pressure. We've got time and we'll have time for questions. So please welcome and thank you again, Diana.
Well, thank you so much. So today, I just wanted to talk briefly about Indigenous communities and some healing opportunities in land, love, and original instructions as we talk about these climate changes and environmental resistance. And I'm just going to play my slideshow. There we are. All right. Before I get going, I just want to first acknowledge our relations in the room today, or in the virtual room, as we should say. Not only do I want to acknowledge the ancestors of the land upon which I reside, as well as the ancestors of the land upon which all of you reside, but I also want to pay respect to all of our ancestors that we carry with us. And I think that's really important as we move through, because we all have been supported and uplifted and are here today due to our ancestors that travel with us. So first of all, halito sa hachapuyat Michelle Johnson Jennings, mija aine inki shapukona, Choctaw si hoke. So I hail from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. That's the image up in the right-hand corner of our mountains there. They're smaller, but they are mountains. I currently reside on the Snohomish Territory outside of Seattle, just north thereof, and work for the University of Washington. But I would say first and foremost, I am informed by my community. That's me as a young baby sitting on one of my grandmother's laps at the top, and then surrounded by family and I like to say a gang of supporters, as well as being guided by my grandmothers and all that I do. And all that I do in my work, I work for my family to the right. Those are my 4 children and my partner, Derek Jennings. And I am a clinical health psychologist by training, but as I say, I get paid to profess and to fully profess for a living, which is wonderful because that allows me to carry forward our cultural traditions of storytelling and seeing life in a new lens, as you've been talking about today. And so just briefly, because I'm not sure if everyone has the context of Indigenous peoples and who we are the original stewards of the lands here in Turtle Island. And we say Turtle Island broadly meaning a North American continent. And we have over 574 tribes, 200 currently spoken languages. We are very distinct and very different in our cultural backgrounds and ways. There are 5.2 million of us today here in the US alone, but we're also sovereign nations. So we are citizens of a nation. We have treaties and legalities that apply to us who do not apply to other peoples. For instance, as a citizen of my tribal nation, currently there's rulings that if I get pulled over on Indian territory, Indian lands, that I am not subjected to possibly state officers at the moment. So this is going on in Oklahoma, some litigations there. And so when I enter into a reservation territory, I am subject to their laws. So for instance, in Washington, once I enter into a reservation, I have to abide by their laws, and I can, if I do something wrong, unfortunately, hopefully I wouldn't, but if I did, I would be served by tribal police or federal as well. So that's the difference with Indigenous peoples. It's not just a race, it's also a citizenship, and we belong to our nations. I also want to give the caveat before I discuss a little bit more. The majority of us are strong and healthy. We have very strong communities. We are doing quite well. We have our stories, we have our languages, we have our culture, and we have our teachings about the earth and how to be with Mother Earth. Now, we have also been resilient for thousands of years. I have an image of one of the tribal communities that's related to my children, up at the top of the Great Flood that happened. So we have tales of a great flood that covered the earth, as many cultures do. We have tales of how we were resilient and adapted when the flooding occurred, how we could prepare for it, and how we could continue to thrive. As a Choctaw person, we also have tales of overpopulating when we had to move to an island during the flood. We have tales of what we had to do and how we had to work with Mother Earth and find new territory to live. So climate migration has been something in our tellings in the past for a very long time, with lots of wisdom of how we can move forward. Now, just to briefly cover, we do have colonial trauma as a matter of policy within the US. So there were first genocidal attacks, as you may know, against Indigenous people that has continued well into this century with illegal sterilizations. And there has been removal from our lands, so from our sacred territories, as well as illegalization of our healing practices until 1978. So this is within my lifetime that we have just been allowed to practice some of our ceremonies, some of our ways of being on the land with Mother Earth. And of course, starvation was a tactic to remove us from our land. And boarding schools, children were removed from their boarding schools, 4 years old, 5 years old, moved hundreds of miles away. My grandparents were as well. Look, my grandmother was able to make it back home and still spoke our language until she taught herself English as an older teenager. But, the others were not as lucky, right? And so we've had all kinds of research done upon us. We've been removed. We've been told that we can't have our animals and live with the relationship with their land as we normally did, but we had to do gardening in a prescribed way, and we had to maintain animals in a prescribed way, which really interrupted our sacred teachings of how to live in harmony upon the land. So when we think about solastalgia and intersectionality, for Indigenous people, we've had this since white settlers arrived to the US, what is now the US. And until the present day, we have been removed from our lands. We have grieved for our original homelands, grieved for what we had before since those times. And I think, as we think about this, it's like taking our canoes out of water, even, and placing them upon the land. We have been working with not only the trauma of this, but also trying to address how we can get back to the ways that our ancestors have prescribed for us to be well. Just to give you an idea, as we have the US that was in development, we now currently only hold, and you can see in the red, a very small portion of the US for Indigenous tribal lands. In Oklahoma, it's quite larger. There were over 60 tribes removed to Oklahoma, where I'm originally from. And part of this removal was really under the idea of manifest destiny. And that has really impacted Indigenous people. Andrew Jackson, when he removed us from our homelands, supposedly we signed treaties, but I know even for my nation, we did not actually agree to sign the treaties. There was just one individual who stayed behind and signed. Our 7 grandmothers who led our tribal communities actually stood up and said, no, we will not move. But this was done because we were objectified and seen as inferior. And the manifest destiny not only impacted our removal, but there's also discussions about how that frame of thought of the ability to take the land because you are superior and use it to your own needs in whatever way you see fit actually also drove a lot of the climate change that we're seeing today, right? And not working in harmony with the land, not being respectful of Mother Earth and respectful of the people who live there. And I just have up here, these thoughts still pervade today. The IQ test in particular was tested upon American Indian children in boarding schools. When they scored higher, they changed the test to make sure that we scored lower. And it's still utilized today in educational systems. So I think we need to recognize that those thoughts are not just relics of the past, but today as we move forward with the idea of environmental trauma. Now, also, we could see that this is manifested against Indigenous women. There's been lots of links to the taking of the land and the taking of Indigenous women and what that means for us. We have many cases of murder missing Indigenous women across the US. It's very pervasive. And there are a lot of cases that are not even addressed by federal FBI agents because we're not seen as necessarily as real people living cultures there today. And in the Pacific Coast where I am, it really started before the gold rush, but really during the gold rush, you could see Indigenous women being mistreated as a matter of common practice. And some would say that's still happening today. Now, the land trauma disconnected us from the lands, the waters, the sky, and our relations with our non-human kin. And this is really impactful upon Indigenous people. You can see this pile of bison skulls, right, of where U.S. policy was just to remove them from the lands as quickly as they could. But luckily today, a lot of indigenous tribal groups are reviving the land through introducing bison again to our territories. And what we see when bison are able to free roam, they actually restore a lot of the plants that are native to the land. They restore the land. So that's very important to know that there are things that we can do to address land trauma and to heal the land. Because for indigenous people, we don't just take from the land and heal from the land, but it's bi-directional, that when we're on the land living in a good way, we also heal the land. And so that's very important as well. Now, I also just want to briefly bring up, this is systematic, right? U.S. policy of taking. They have taken our language out loud, they've taken our ceremonies, they've taken our stories, they've taken our culture, they've taken our children, they've taken so much. And this is very intentional. It's not a loss. We didn't lose anything. So I hope to someday never hear that Indigenous people have lost our stories or lost our culture or lost our ceremonies. I mean, when you say someone's lost something, that's implying blame, right? You didn't take enough care of it. You put it somewhere. You didn't have the safeguards up. But this is actually very systematic. And it was a stealing of our lands and our ways of being. And this has resulted in up to 50% of all Indigenous children lived in foster home or boarding schools by the 1940s, and that's my child there, and our culture has been commodified as something to go visit, as a relic of the past, something that you could see, but not necessarily seen as a culture that's thriving and living today. And that has evolved as time has gone by, right? And so you also had 25% of Native women were forced to sterilize or legally sterilized by 1976, as many as 70,000 women, really rampant within Oklahoma, where I grew up as well. But however, we also know that cases are still happening today of women not being informed, and sterilization being a matter of policy for Indigenous women. Now, we think about all this in historical trauma that's occurred upon the land. And when we think about historical trauma, that's mass trauma, right? So across generations, a whole community experiences the trauma. It could be from something within the environment, or something as massacres or starvation from the land as well. And then we get a historical trauma responses, right? And so when we have this massive wounding across a community, subsequent generations will have, they see an epigenetic work now, switches that get turned on, right? Saying it's a hostile world, our body reacts, turns a switch on, say it's hostile out there, be careful. In utero, we get these messages, right? And then we're born. And those switches that get turned on actually correlate to other health conditions, particularly addiction risks and chronic disease risks, as well as some physical health conditions that correlate with this. And we see this across all groups, not just Indigenous. When we see famines and Dutch famine, for instance, you can see this occur. But for Indigenous people, the historical trauma disrupted our connection to cultural continuity as well, right? To our ancestral teachings, our original instructions around the land and Mother Earth, and those wise and healthy practices. Indigenous people experience a lot of environmental land and water trauma, historical and present day. We have environmental contamination levels. A lot of the pipelines and other environmental contamination actually directed right to Indigenous reservation lands. So we have a lot of spills where Indigenous people live. We have a lot of climate change stressors that affect us disproportionately. And of course, the built environment has a lot of structural racism built into it as well. Now, all of this gives rise to a lot of health disparities. Again, majority of Indigenous people are healthy and doing quite well, but we have a very high case of alcohol-induced deaths. That does not mean Indigenous people drink alcohol more than other people. In fact, we're most likely not to drink alcohol. But of those who do, we do have a high rate of binge drinking and deaths by driving or other instances of accidents related to or diseases related to alcohol-induced deaths, which could be a substitute actually for suicidal behavior. In a lot of cases, this is what's been discussed in communities. Now, we also have high rates of chronic liver disease and cirrhosis, not necessarily related to alcoholism, actually. So liver diseases are actually related to fatty liver disease or other conditions within the environment that's causing this. I have other diabetes, accidental injuries, of course, are quite high with Indigenous people. And that's been known for quite a while. We've had a lot of improvements actually in our health and well-being. But I do have up there, assault is a leading cause of death and homicide. And again, I think that's important just to mention that as we assault the land, and historically, as we see this occurring, we see a high rate of assaults against Indigenous people who are connected to the land. In fact, 90% of all cases of assaults against Indigenous people, both men and women, up to 80% have been assaulted at some point, but up to 90% are done by non-Indigenous people. Usually it's white settlers who are committing the offenses against us, as well as we have some of the highest rates of death due to police. Now, we know that if we have land trauma, it affects our health. We have stories of if we mistreat the land, if we mistreat the spirits of the water, what that will do. We'll have flooding, we'll have diseases that occur because we're not in balance with the land. And we know that through environmental contamination, there have been many researchers looking at how it increases liver disease among Indigenous people. So if you remember, Indigenous liver disease is quite high. And if Indigenous people are living in places that are more highly contaminated than other populations, of course, you're going to see the results upon us. You also have salmon here in the Pacific Northwest that are dying off, orcas as well. That's going to greatly affect our culture, our ways of being practices here in this area, as well as Hawaiian Islands. Are experiencing a lot of flooding, and it's impacting their culture and ways of being as well. Now, we have climate migration and forced relocation that's occurring. We see that present day with the Jean Charles Choctaw Nation, they've had to be removed from the island they currently lived on. We also know that United Hawaiian Nation, whom I work with, has been severely impacted by climate change and environmental degradation. But as Indigenous people have experienced this, you can see one of the aunties, Miss Parfait there, the bottom photo, is actually still smiling as she's sitting on her porch. And as I work with Indigenous peoples across the world, what I often see is that there is a graciousness for what happens. And there is still such hope and such resilience that we can do something to change, and we can get back in balance and harmony with our environment. Because land is life and water is life, right? And we know that there's been lots of movements, lots of protests against pipelines, environmental degradation to help support our health and well-being today. And in particular, our Indigenous women have taken up this cause to a great degree, as well as Indigenous men, but Indigenous women in particular are seen as water carriers and as protectors and related to Mother Earth. Now, place-based justice comes up quite a bit too, working with Indigenous communities. And, part of that is not just having justice and learning in the environment of what we can do, but a part of that is restoration. So in a lot of the health interventions that I do with communities, we also include like cane restoration, for instance, or gardening, or planting trees that have that need a little bit of extra help, or sacred plants or medicines that are needed to grow. And so we do this to be in balance and to give back to the lands and all that we do. If we go out on the lands, we then develop those responsibilities and relationships to those lands. And we find that it actually helps in health prevention efforts, as well as in health outcomes. And we can also transform trauma and have relational restoration. So though I have on here Ochash, it's our word in Choctaw that we would say to call upon our ancestors for guidance. One way is that we do that is to call upon them to help guide us today by reclaiming our ancestral practices, revitalizing those stories that were taken, the songs that were taken, those ways of that were taken from us. We've learned that we can come together and create new songs, new ways to be on Mother Earth through coming together and praying and entering states of fasting and discussing with one another and other cultures about what we can do today to create a better world for our future generations. And that really goes back to having love at our hearts. As we get back to Mother Earth, we're surrounded by her love, embraced by that. And then we can really start focusing on being resilient in what we do today. So I'm a director of a land-based healing division here at University of Washington. And we go back to the land. Anything we do upon the land, we see as land-based healing, right? For health intervention wise. We see that in Indigenous frameworks, land is centered and prominent. Our ancestral instructions are to be found on the land. If we observe nature, we can get back to understanding the teachings that they have for us. And we have a mutual respect. We can't abuse medicines. That's embedded within all our stories. Even food, if we overeat food, it comes back to harm us in the forms of teeth rotting out or obesity. If we overuse our tobacco or we abuse our tobacco, it comes back to harm us as well. So we have to keep that balance with Mother Earth and with the plants and animals and all that we do. And we have to create the space. We have to have the space to have the place and the meaning attached to place of our ancestors, to have the sacredness and to have a community orientation to healing. It's not about individuals, but the collective whole, as we're all on Mother Earth together. Of course, in Western medicine and being trained as psychologists, it's very different in our training. We talk about ancestors having diseases that they passed on to you, what they put you at risk for, what did they do to you, instead of what they've gifted you with and what you can carry forward today. And we, of course, don't really talk much about land when we talk about healing in a Western context. And I think when we talk about environmental changes and climate change, we really need to think about ourselves as situated upon the land. We also don't do a good job of talking about love in a Western context. Of course, we talk about trauma, right? Environmental trauma, how we can be resilient, how we can move forward from the trauma, but we don't give enough space for love to be discussed. And it's just as powerful. I mean, I always like to say Western science is just catching up with Indigenous teachings, right? We're seeing that love can turn off those switches that get turned on for generations from trauma. If we have a loving, supportive environment before the age of 5, we can help protect someone from being at risk for these diseases. And that's how powerful love is. And when we get back to the land, we can really get back in touch with that love. You can feel it. And that's so important as I do work in Indigenous communities. When we go outside upon the land, love is discussed all of the time. In our qualitative interviews, we do it. It also figures prominently with feeling the love of the land. And as we feel that, we know our bodies is affected, but we also start thinking about the future generations and the past generations. And so we situate ourselves. Our ancestors loved us so much that they dreamt this and got through those hard times for us. And how will we carry that love forward to the future generations? And as a researcher, I try to center love in my research methods. I draw from other scholars of the past. Bell Hooks, of course, fabulous. Loving ethics, working for a collective good, really overlaps with a lot of my Indigenous teachings. And so I think there's a lot of overlap between different cultural lenses of looking at how we can practice and how we can help shape the world to create a better place. And so what we find overall, I found in my own personal work, is returning to the land gives us healing opportunities. We get to have love and we get to reconnect with those original instructions, and as I've heard time and time again from youth, from elders, from adults, is I cannot be healthy unless my waters and land are healthy. And this occurs when I do a diabetes intervention project, right? I've worked in medical clinics and the kids will come in and say, well, how can I be healthy if the water outside's unhealthy? How can we talk about eating right and exercising or taking my blood glucose levels if the water's not healthy, if the air's not healthy to breathe? It just doesn't make sense to address one and not the other. Of course, there are scientific benefits to land-based cultural interventions. Getting outside is so important for us. Again, our Indigenous elders have known this. I've been told this. I've been told my kids have to be outside. It's important for me to be outside to touch the earth since I was a young child up until today. But Western science, again, is just catching up and finding, of course, when we go outside and touch the earth, it alters the chemicals in our brains. We have more dopamine. We have more serotonin that flows through our brains. But also it increases our immunity. During COVID, we saw people who went outside had better immunity than people who stayed indoors. It decreases our blood glucose levels. It addresses, people who have diabetes type 2, if they go outside more, it's really important for them to get outside, and decreases our cortisol levels, which does when we decrease our stress levels, it does a whole host of good for our body, right? But also, it gets back in touch with our original instructions and keeps us grounded. If we're outside more, I believe that we care more. If children are outside more at recess, for instance, then they would care more about the earth and about what's happening with climate change. We're able to observe in ways that we're not able to online or through media, for instance. And we're more likely to have long-term behavioral changes if we learn something outside. So if we were all outside right now, you would be more likely to remember what I'm saying. So I feel like we really need to get in the dirt first before we think about health research in particular, and that goes back to the land. We need to decolonize, think about how we've adapted to trauma, what we do today that may not be helpful for us, how we may have changed our stories or our narratives based on that trauma, and done the so to survive, which was important. But also we need to remember to indigenize, to go back to those ancestral teachings, see what that means for us, so that we can revitalize our practices and create a world in which we can thrive and continue to thrive. We have lots of thrive-ins occurring across Turtle Island. Within Indigenous communities, people are doing quite well. They're doing the revitalizing, they're creating action for the earth. And this has been really important because we're growing for the ancestral wisdom to do healthful practices today. Now, Indigenous cosmologies, of course, see the world in 4 different worlds. I'll just briefly say it's really important that we see the world within balance. There's so many teachings layered within this drawing that actually anthropologists drew based on a lot of our stories and teachings. I can't go into all of it today, but I think when you think about Indigenous cosmology, it's just not one earth that we're in, but it's the upper world, the lower world, ancestors past, present, and future as we move forward. And, we see well-being as a holistic process, as connection to place, to others, to self. A lot of work I do, I work with groups within the US, I work with groups within Canada, up at Arctic Circle, I work in Aotearoa, New Zealand as well, and where we get back to the land. And basically in all the projects that we do, I have a couple of randomized clinical trials. I won't bore you with the details of those, but they're really exciting in that we're talking about what our ancestors envisioned us to be and what ancestor we want to become, because we're all future ancestors in the making right now. So whether you have children or not, our generation is going to be looked upon as the ancestors. And so what can we do today that can help build a better world for the future generations? And I think that is so critical and so important. And I'll just show you a few images as I close out of land-based healing camps we've done with research projects. Some lands up in Canada that have been untouched presently, of course, are being impacted by climate change for sure. New Orleans, outside of New Orleans, a Homa Nation. People again see love as so powerful when they get out on the land and seeing their ancestors and their words through the land and water, decolonizing space, getting back to the place that facilitates well-being. And I will just end with, in everything that we do, research or otherwise, we want to be doing it in a good way. And that's really a sacred endeavor that illuminates the connections between the spiritual and the physical world. So I just want to say yokoke, or thank you to all those who are working on these issues, who are addressing climate change and the environment today. So yokoke.
Wow. Wow. Thank you, Dr. Johnson Jennings. Thank you. It's everyone would like for that slideshow to be in a PDF. The information, we need to just keep taking it in, and the richness of the healing that you and colleagues and Indigenous peoples are showing us, and being the director of the Healing Opportunities and Land and Love and Original Instruction. I just love that title, Land and Love. Your willingness to talk out loud about profound, very activist engaged transformation that's Indigenous communities have always known and teach. And this core theme of love as a kind of activist edge, it's extremely powerful in the history of trauma subjugation. Thank you so deeply. please, everyone, I've tried there to name a little bit of Dr. Johnson Jennings' amazing resume and her titles. She is at the University of Washington, and just really bringing tremendous gifts to all of us for health and healing. Thank you again so much. And the questions are pouring in, so I'm going to move right on to Dominique, as we will be finishing this session by 12:30. So we're going to try to tune into that. Dominique is, Malebranche is a licensed psychologist and assistant professor of psychology, particularly working with embodied healing, justice issues in BIPOC communities, and earth-based wisdoms. She's really looking now at communities kind of engaging how they can incorporate identity and community healing with environmental justice. Dominique, I'm just going to move straight into your being present with us, and I will give it to you.
Thank you so much. Hopefully my audio is okay, as this will be my primary medium for being with you all today. Again, big thanks to the LOCA initiative for having me, and just this wonderful panel, this wonderful summit to be a part of. Really so much to digest and integrate, and I'm hoping that what I can bring to us today can be an opportunity for all of us to do that a little bit more together. So as was just mentioned, I'm a soul servant by current way of psychologist, professor, educator, embodiment facilitator, and practitioner through liberatory yoga practice, meditation, breathwork. And I'm joining you today based and working on the traditional lands of Tongva and Chumas, also known as Los Angeles, California. And really appreciating the previous talks, particularly this last one that has really brought the awareness for us to be mindful of the ancestors that we carry with us. As today I'm carrying with me my ancestors of African descent, their names and identities, traditions and practices that have been taken and lost and forgotten by way of human trafficking across the seas and enslavement of Africans, as well as my closest ancestors impacted by French colonial state in Haiti, and especially those ancestors that were in deep relationship with the ocean, whom have recently been speaking through me as I've listened more deeply. So what I'd like to share with you all today, my approach to resilience really mirrors that of what is shared on the website for this summit, that really highlights resilience as the capacity and the condition for individual societies and ecosystems to be able to adapt. And when I think about capacity building specifically, it requires a set of skills and practices, as well as our ability to really understand and clarify what are these conditions that we envision. And so I'm reminded of practice, of course, contemplative practice, embodiment practice. And so instead of sharing with you a framework of my thinking and of my work, I'd like to, as I've been called to by ancestors in my dreams most recently, to share a visioning meditation with you today, as well as a bit of a poem or prayer. And so if you'd like to engage in this practice, of course, it's just a welcoming invitation. I just want to invite you into a space, place, both mentally and emotionally, where you might be able to visualize and set into a bit of future setting, a bit of visioning, right? So that might look like turning your camera off or shifting your body away from the screen so that you can be in more engagement with your own sense of self. As I plan to kind of take us on this journey into the future, I want to first be mindful that we can first ground in the present. So grounding in the seat that you're in, or the bed that you lie in this moment. Maybe grounding with a cup of tea, the warmth of coffee, or the coolness of a glass of water in your hands. Maybe grounding in this moment with a blanket, any type of nourishment that helps you feel connected to the now as we dream and envision into the future. So taking a moment to situate here. I invite you to allow your eyes to gently close if that feels accessible to you. And if not, just a light gaze at something that's not too distracting could work as well. Now I invite us into a collective breath together. I think I heard over 1,500 of us here together. May we breathe in through our nose and out through our mouths. Maybe taking that in one more time through our nose and out through our mouths. Finding a sense of settling. As you notice your breath here, however it's moving, whatever thoughts might be still landing for you, seeing if you can find a place of direction where you can move your consciousness a little bit into the future, maybe 30 years into the future, taking you through the visions and the cosmos and the sense of, or the construct of time, to land into this place. Here we are. I want to thank you for tuning in to this live broadcast from the Global Council of Embodied Learning. My name is Dominique Milbranch. I'll be giving our address this year, and it is my pleasure to invite us all into our annual celebration. Today, on August 10th, 2050, we welcome another celebration of the People's Day of Liberation. This is a day where we remember, we honor, and we celebrate our liberated lands and waters and our journey of dreaming and actualizing this moment. Our sacrifices, they did not go unnoticed. We listened to teachers like Lama Rod Owens, who then 30 years ago reminded us that our care had to be as strong, if not stronger, than the intensity of the systems that we are trying or were trying to survive. Because today we celebrate how our care has been clear, structured, boundaried, and restorative. Let's breathe in today's non-polluted air, siblings. Noticing in this moment what it feels like, what sensations arise, what thoughts are present on this day of celebration, what emotions might be able to emerge. We have dreamed about this day, many of us, for centuries. Let's notice together the emotions that we've had to overcome and the realities of our lives that we've had to recognize. We thank those of us, our elders and our ancestors, who dreamed this future into a reality that we can live and share today. May we bring their names to mind silently in this moment. Those who helped pave the way for us today. Today we gather together from our home, that place where we belong, where we feel seen, settling in a sense of place and a sense of space. Where is that for you, sibling? As we're here today, may you picture yourself in this place, its surroundings, this home where you have all the resources you need, this home that offers, this home that we're in reciprocal relationship with. What's around you creating this sense of home? Notice what you're wearing today. What is your celebratory attire for the day? As we look around, we see our loved ones from all over. Who do you see in your proximity? Who's with you? Who can you sense in the distance? Siblings, together we can offer shared gratitude and embodied love through our gaze at one another, our kind thoughts toward each other, and an attitude of kinship. Grateful for their leadership, we look to those who have guided us. We honor silence for our notable leaders that came, went, and are here with us today. We name those influential people. We reflect on how they played a part in sharing and redistributing power. And one of my favorite great rituals of our celebration is to reflect on the various headlines that have made way toward our progress, creating safe and just systems that had led us to the celebration. Go ahead, take a few moments here to recall some of your favorite news headlines that affirmed for you that we were moving in the right and radical direction over the last 30 years. Now, as you walk the streets today, like our tradition every year, be sure to bring that loving gaze to the world around you. Notice what others are wearing on this People's Day of Liberation. The colors, textures, designs, styles, the quality of energy that people carry on their bodies. Like every day, we let no day pass without communing with our kin, Mother Nature. Lonely no more. Folks, we are lonely no more. Friends, let's take a moment to connect our one breath to hers. Moment after moment after moment with our mother. It is through this connection that we have moved fear from our bodies, from our beings. For this, we give thanks to our Indigenous siblings who have taught us through modeling how to be with the biodiversity of our world. Come, let us touch the earth here. Let's sit with the water. Here, we have found stability. In those who have been most impacted by climate change, we have found direction, for it was you who thoughtfully stewarded our resources for collective liberation. We bask in all of the previous efforts to connect care and resources for the betterment of all people, plants, and sentient beings. And today we rejoice in our collective ritual of embodiment. What will you choose to do today? Which practice will bring you most joy and nourishment? Who might you share it with? No matter what you choose, let us choose with the intention in our heart that solidarity won again, with mutual respect, shared values, and collective liberation and collective responsibility. So we gather, we dance, we embrace the joyful celebration of the future that is today, and the space for the grief that was carried 30 years ago. And we give thanks and praise today, August 10th, 2050, that we have made it here together. God willing, please continue to position us as stewards. And let us not forget that revolution is not a moment, it is a practice. Inviting your breath back into presence, allowing the future to settle into today. Bringing your attention back to the present moment of where you sit or where you lie in this moment. I might offer as I close here, just as we can connect to the sacred and transformative power of the element of fire, of the flame. May we light our visions today like incense, allowing the smoke to move up toward the heavens. In this next moment, whenever you're ready, if you're ready and willing, I'm going to close with a brief share of what emerged for me in my vision late last night, early this morning in this meditation. And you're welcome to stay in a meditative state. You're welcome to lift your eyelids, come back out, maybe share into the chat any of your favorite headlines from 2050. But I'm going to close here with my incense, my prayer in a form of poem of sorts. With one breath, I open my eyes and I see everything that is, everything that was, and everything that will be. With one breath, we have grieved and we have found ourselves, and we have grieved and found each other. It is miraculous how we've all learned and understood our emotions and have learned to connect with our shadows that have led us to our solutions. We have unlearned trauma responses that have helped us drop unconscious defenses and relearned how to relate to ourselves and the world around us. We are grateful for the models that have helped us transform conflict to build deeper interdependence. This was a collective feat, from humanities across psychologies, dipping into somatic, transformative, and decolonial approaches, and out through the sciences. It is only here where we have been able to critically analyze power, redistribute where necessary, and empower our communities to amplify our strengths, which has led to divesting from systems that have exploited Earth's natural resources for profit. This is in the past, of course. With one breath, we have moved to reject false binaries, drawing from the wisdom of queer, trans, and non-binary ways of creating new worlds, and are gently guided by our siblings with disabilities and beautifully neurodivergent minds, and our elders and our older adults. Thankfully, children have also reestablished their rightful position as our teachers with their creativity and curiosity. We have embraced the intergenerational transmission of resilience, which has now become a way of life for all. Histories and wisdoms of plants and people led by Indigenous and Black people have reemerged, remembering We remember by sinking our hands into the soil. We remember when the textures mix and we allow the land to be medicine to our bodies, just like the herbs that our grandmothers grew and harvested for my daily teas today. With just one breath, we are practicing to treat each other as the plants do. In one breath, memories recalled, yet reclamation, connection, and play in the moment takes precedence. Black bodies, young and aged, return to the water, remembering who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going, returning to the water as ancestral practice, where we source life and birth emergence, the body, our body, into the body of healing. Because in one breath, I have seen, witnessed, experienced fear and death of oppression and enslavement removed, and instead life lifted by the spirit of the sea herself. We have re-engaged with the beauty and the love of our mother ocean. Allow me to share this reflection from my own reclamation, liberation, connection, and play with the ocean by my way of somatic freediving. Yes, that is the way of one breath. With permission and prayer, always in ceremony, my body swims to hers. One breath at the surface. Yet beneath the surface, silence is power. Yet everything that needs to be heard is audible. Echoes from dolphins, songs of the whales, an ecosystem in divine order, the sound of life. In the ocean, reciprocity is coin, a functioning system in full respect of each other, even toward me as I immerse my body into her body. Though I too must operate in humility with deep respect. Under the water, spirit gives, and with no breath, only life force of the spirit I receive. Coming up for air is always a recommitment to solidarity with the mother and a reciprocity to protect life. Three breaths of hope for 3 breaths of recovery. In one breath, I see us choose to be in contact with her, the mother. And as it has been said, we protect the things that we love. And protect is what we have done. It only takes one breath. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Dr. Jameson. I'm going to take one breath and suggest with Decala's embrace that we extend our time slightly. There are some questions. I'm imagining, Dr. Malabrosh, that there'll be lots of responses. But the richness of this panel, we just couldn't have imagined. And so grateful it drew a full fruition line. So thank you all. We're going to keep going for about 10 more minutes if you can stay with us too. I'm going to, we've got some questions here, and Dr. Johnson Jennings, I'd like to turn to one of them with you in mind, as it seems really pertinent and important. Is it appropriate for Blacks or other persons of color to utilize the wisdom and stories of Indigenous cultures to cope with our current climate crisis?
I would say yes, if it's done in a good way. So lots of Indigenous elders, lots of knowledge keepers are very happy to share their knowledges, or we call it our ecological knowledges with others, just so long as it's not appropriated, so it's not taken, not recognized as coming from our Indigenous communities. I mean, we have lots of instances that happening in the past, right? Especially around medicines, 1990s, over 90% of the medicines came from our traditional medicines. Indigenous people is still happening today. Psychedelics is another way that we've had misappropriation. Of course, we have a lot of new age things that have appropriated our culture and taken it out of context. But I think that when you do so in partnership with Indigenous people and you get the adequate respect and honoring and working with them, that it's really seen as mutually giving, right? That we work back and forth with other cultures and communities to share what we know and then to also learn from others. So, but thank you for that question.
Beautiful. And kind of interweaving. And I think one of the things that's emerged in these 3 days together is that kind of profound interdependence with respect, with asking, with acknowledgement. And that's helpful. Thanks, so helpful. Diana, Dr. Liverman, there's someone wanted to know if energy is based on a renewable system, or is energy kind of based by the coal oil industries as they currently understand it. I guess when you're using the term energy.
Well, if it was in relation to giving access to everyone for energy, we were doing a thought experiment in that, where we calculated the emissions if the so-called bottom billion got access to energy for well-being given the current energy structure. But then we also looked at what would happen if there was a shift, not just to renewables, but to more efficient use of energy. And then, so if you have technology shifts, then that both gives access to the poor and reduces pressure on the Earth system. And we also looked at what happened if we took the consumption of the top 20% and reduced it to the third level. And it's amazing that if you just reduce the very high levels of consumption of the richest, you both reduce pressure on planetary boundaries and allow access to those without. So the consumption shift doesn't mean everybody comes to a sort of minimum level of water and energy use. It's just a reallocation from high consumers to everybody else.
Reallocation. Yeah, that's very helpful. It's very clear. Thank you so much, Diane. Dominique, there's a question for you from David Takahashi. And the question is non-binary another way of expressing non-duality? I've also heard it referred to as complementary duality, or are they different?
Yes, thank you for the question. Yeah, in my reflection today, my reference to non-binary is in reference to the gendered construct that we have typically used within the functions of binaries, and the recognition of the multiplicity, the complexity, the diversity of genders that can be expressed through our various beings. And there's a connection, I think, with not relating to false binaries of gender, but also thinking about false binaries within our reality state. where separation and disconnection can be born and bred from. So I think yes, we can think about this connection around non-duality, or this idea that we don't come from these separate kind of objects, these distinct things, but there's this interrelated connection of a unified whole that I think we need to pay more attention to in our embodied beings, our identities, our gendered expressions, but also in the ways in which we think about problems and solutions and ways of moving about the world through some of that more nuanced perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very helpful kind of landscape. Thank you. Dr. Johnson Jennings, there's a question. It's a great one. Why is walking in the beauty so difficult?
Well, I am not positive what is meant by that per se, but my guess is that it's referring to Indigenous ideas of going outside and walking in beauty. I would say it's not difficult. That actually refers to me, in my line of thought, is that it's actually talking about when we go outside, that we take stock of the beauty in which we walk, right? When we go throughout our day, we are grateful, we are humble, we recognize what's being gifted to us. And that's where the beauty lies, right? Being so grateful for all that we have. And then again, when we do that, we instill the internal responsibility to maintain it. We're receiving such beauty from the lands. What are we doing to give back? And that's how we walk through it with beauty, right?
Yes. Wow. That's so, and the work that you have done with communities, so many communities across the world, being land-based, place-based storytellings from the land. It's like the embodiment of that. It's very, and I love the picture of your child, and I know your pride in your 4 children.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's so good. So rich. There's a beauty.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. I'm wondering, Diane, if you seem to find such enthusiastic power by the local work and by the politics. Maybe that's another kind of beauty, that kind of engaged activism. Can you speak to that? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a way of dealing with the burnout of trying to work at the global level, and also to connect to the land I live on, and the ancestors of those lands. And I did want to say in the chat, one of the things, my university, we have a land acknowledgement like many others, but what I'm glad about is the university is now putting a lot of resources into Indigenous issues. And we actually have an Indigenous Resilience Center that now has a lot of faculty, and they're running graduate training programs. And of course, it's not enough. We're a land grab university. So there's a lot we need to do to restore what was stolen. But I do think it's really important for universities to not just acknowledge, but to make a commitment. And I would say the other thing about, when scientists become local activists, I have to control my sort of expertise and know-it-allness and just listen. So I literally have to meditate before I go to a meeting to make sure that I'm doing enough listening and not enough telling. So I'll shut up.
Well, Emory is in a serious journey, and I think of it as a long journey with the Muskogee Creek, whose land we are on, and they've been, we've gone to them in Oklahoma, their communities, their colleges, they're coming to us. It's a long-term process, including art on the campus that will keep us mindful in that kind of visceral, experiential way. So it's a journey. I'm going to ask all 3 of you, and we'll close with this. is, let me just see, somehow my questions, here it is. If any of you have thoughts about this, as a Black person, I feel, and we'll stop with this question, I feel very grateful for my ancestors' wildest dreams, but also a sense of guilt that my ancestors and even living Black folks experienced forced enslavement, injustice, and greater amounts of traumatic stress. Do you have any wisdom for coping with this guilt? I think Michelle and Dominique certainly.
Well, I would encourage the consideration of not necessarily feeling guilt for what's been done to your ancestors without their fault or their blame, right? Like they didn't have that done to themselves. So but I would say that how we re-narrate those stories of trauma are to focus on that love that got them through. So as I go back and look at all of our Indigenous people and when they've gone through times of extreme trauma, and I'm talking about even my own Choctaw Nation, I had a grandmother who was 9, had to carry her little brother on her back and walk barefoot in the snow, right? And marching, frostbitten feet, what have you. And when I read her reflections of that, it's not that it was so horrible and this is so wrong, which it was. But the reflections are, I carried him because I loved not only him, but the 7 generations forward. So every step I took, I focus on that love. And that's what got me through. And I think about that. And it's so profound for me because my children are the 7th generation from her. And so I'm able to tell them, your grandparent and loved you so much that they did this for you before you were ever even thought of in the terms of creation, right? But you were loved. And I think that love and that strength that got them through is so profound. And it's not just my tribal community. Every time we look at a community that's experienced some type of trauma, you will see the people who made it through talk about that love for the future generations. And I would imagine that whether it's Indigenous or Black ancestors, they also love those future generations so much. And it's that love that gets you through. Because in those times, it has to be something greater, right? It's not the hatred or the feeling so awful that this happened to you. Because again, it did, and it's horrible. It's inhumane. It's outlandish. But the thing that gets them through and gets them to heal and to create new families and to get us where we are today was that love. And so re-narrating those stories can be quite profound for us to heal and just to also know that we have to move that love forward to the next generation.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd just like to add to that, although that was very well said, Dr. Johnson Jennings, and would agree with that. In addition to that, especially for those of us where some of our connection to our ancestors have been lost, we might not know their names, we might not know specific places where we're from, we might not know those particular traditions. Really important for us to find those opportunities to reclaim our sense of identity through those cultural practices. So as we're considering what love looks like, how has that been practiced through food traditions, through gathering traditions and fellowship traditions, through song, through dance, through other modes of embodiment practice, for instance, that help connect us to parts of us that we might not have speech or language for. And the more I think that we can connect to those parts of us that might not have names that are known or language that is known, we are reconnecting to a sense of love that re-narrates our sense of identity and actually situates us in an identity that Dr. Sarah King was talking about on the first day, the identity that is intergenerational, that we are individuals in this moment in time, but we are connected to our ancestors before, centered 7 generations back and beyond, and our descendants ahead 7 generations forward and beyond. And so, yes, being able to connect and re-engage with that sense of self through our lineage is another important piece.
Yeah. Wow, wonderful. Thank you, Deco. I'm just about to, but everyone, there was another playful question, Diana. They wanted pictures of the dogs, but mine just left the room with my sweet husband.
I tried to I tried to post a photo in the chat, but it doesn't let you post photos.
Let me thank the panelists just from my deep heart. Such a rich session, obviously, and I was grateful to participate. Dekala, please.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you. That was just so heart-opening. I mean, mind-opening. Just wonderful to have all three of you presenting from your bodies of work, from your heart of work,